Hello and welcome to Art of Reading. Today I want to talk about postmodernism, an extremely controversial movement in the latter half of the 20th century. Postmodernism as a movement is very broad, and it encompasses a wide variety of fields and disciplines like the visual arts, poetry, philosophy and architecture. So I will try to limit this video and focus only on postmodernist fiction. The definitions of postmodernism tend to be either too narrow or too broad. So I think one way to approach postmodernist fiction is to enumerate and discuss the recurring themes and characteristics and devices of postmodernist fiction, and that's precisely what I'm going to do in this video. The first characteristic that I'd like to discuss is intertextuality. Now, simply defined, intertextuality means that no text is produced in a vacuum, that all literary works, however innovative and original they might be, build upon their predecessors and borrow from their previous works. So, in fact, intertextuality is not specifically related to postmodernism. It's a characteristic of all literary works. But there is an important difference between the intertextuality of the literary works of other movements and genres and the intertextuality of postmodernist works. And the difference is that postmodernist works wear their intertextuality on their sleeves. They are proud of it, and they even draw the reader's attention to the fact that they are intertexts, that they are building upon previous works. So, while the intertextuality of other works of literature is usually latent and unconscious, the intertextuality of postmodernist works is absolutely overt. So we can see that in many of these postmodernist works, there is an emphasis, a huge emphasis, on the constructedness of that work, on the fact that that work is artificial. So postmodernist works do not have any illusions about the depictions of reality, about realism. They emphasize that they are artificial and they are constructed. Now, there are a number of ways to emphasize this artificiality and this constructedness. One of these ways is to use the device of the pastiche, P-A-S-T-I-C-H-E. Pastiche means imitating a number of genres and then assembling these imitations, putting them together and creating one single whole. So there is an important difference between pastiche and parody. In parody, usually only one single genre is imitated, but in pastiche, a number of genres is imitated. And these imitations are then assembled, they are put together to create one single work. Another difference between the pastiche and the parody is that in parody, the author usually tries to mock and satirize another literary work or another movement, another genre, whereas in pastiche, the stance of the author is usually neutral, and sometimes he or she even pays homage or tribute to the genre or literary work that is imitated. So the use of pastiche emphasizes this constructedness of a literary work, and that's one way that postmodernist writers emphasize the artificiality of their works. One important consequence of the use of pastiche in a literary work is that that work becomes fragmented. So, for instance, in a postmodernist work of fiction, we very often have a non-chronological narrative. In other words, we might get the ending of the story at the beginning of the novel, and we might get to the beginning only at the very end. So fragmentation is a very recurring and dominant characteristic of postmodernist fiction. Modernist works also employ fragmentation, but there is a difference between the fragmentation of modernist works and the fragmentation of postmodernist ones. The main difference, perhaps, is that in modernist literature, the author usually treats this fragmentary nature of contemporary life as a sad thing. the author laments the fact that our lives are fragmented and that there is no overarching and unifying meaning and principle to give sense to our lives. For postmodernist writers, however, this fragmentation is a very positive thing. They even celebrate it as a sign of the multiplicity and pluralism and diversity of contemporary existence. We see that many of these modernist writers, and poets for that matter, try to come up with an overarching principle to give sense of this fragmentation. W.B. Yeats, the great Irish poet, for instance, has his own very intricate and complicated mythological system that somehow lies at the background of many of his poems. This mythological system is that overarching pattern which he uses to give sense to this fragmentation. Or, for instance, James Joyce's famous novel Ulysses is loosely based upon the narrative structure of Homer's Odyssey. That is also another unifying principle that we see in modernist works. But in postmodernist works, we do not see any such tendency. And as I said, this fragmentation is even treated as a positive quality and as a liberating thing, something that emphasizes the multiplicity and pluralism of our contemporary life. Postmodernist writers do not lament the fact that there is no overarching unifying meaning anymore. They in fact treat this as a very good thing. So that's one reason why many of these postmodernist works have a playful quality and do not take things seriously. Indeed, it is very difficult to find an unambiguous and straightforward tragedy in a work of postmodernist fiction, because everything is usually treated very playfully. Apart from pastiche that I talked about earlier, another technique that postmodernist writers employ in their works to emphasize the constructedness and the artificiality of their fiction is metafiction. Metafiction, simply defined, means a kind of fiction that is conscious of its own fictionality. In other words, a story that is aware of its being a story. Authors exploit a number of methods to convey this effect in their works. For instance, a character might address the reader. A character might address the author. The characters might talk to each other about the fact that they are fictional characters. Or, for instance, a novel might incorporate an account of its own creation within itself. All of these are techniques that authors use to create the effect of metafiction in their works and emphasize and foreground the fictionality, the artificiality of their fiction. So postmodernist works are extremely self-aware and self-conscious. That's why there is such a huge emphasis on the very processes of reading and writing in many postmodernist works. And there is such an unusual number of readers and writers in postmodernist fiction. Now, all of these themes and techniques that I discussed up to this point, like intertextuality, the constructed nature of postmodernist works, pastiche, metafiction, fragmentation, all of them can be summarized in this one sentence. Postmodernist works are preoccupied with ontological issues or ontological questions, whereas modernist works are very often preoccupied with epistemological issues and questions. This is how Brian McHale, in his excellent book Postmodernist Fiction, distinguishes between modernist fiction and postmodernist fiction. He tells us that modernist works are very often preoccupied with questions such as these. How can I interpret this world of which I am a part? And what am I in it? What is there to be known? Who knows it? How do they know it, and with what degree of certainty? How is knowledge transmitted from one knower to another, and with what degree of reliability? What are the limits of the knowable? These are the types of questions that modernist works explore. In fact, when we read modernist fiction, we see that maybe the most quintessential and obvious technique that modernist writers employ in their fiction is stream of consciousness. And stream of consciousness is employed solely in order to portray how the human mind works, how we perceive things, how we think. It is a technique that is used to represent and to portray the mechanisms of the human mind, the way our thoughts function. And that is precisely an epistemological preoccupation. But when we turn to postmodernist fiction, these are the questions that postmodernist works explore, according to Brian McHale. Which world is this? What is to be done in it? Which of myselves is to do it? What is a world? What kinds of world are there? How are they constituted and how do they differ? What happens when different kinds of world are placed in confrontation, or when boundaries between worlds are violated? What is the mode of existence of a text, and what is the mode of existence of the world or worlds it projects? These are the kinds of questions that postmodernist works explore, and we can see that these techniques, like pastiche, like intertextuality, like metafiction, are all, in one way or another, related to this ontological preoccupation. For instance, let's look at metafiction. In metafiction, the boundaries between the world of the text and the world of the reader, or the world of the text and the world of the writer, are violated. When a character, for instance, addresses the reader, that character is violating this boundary which separates the world of the text and the world of the reader. In pastiche, we see the juxtaposition of different genres, different worlds, if you like. These worlds, these genres, are placed beside each other without any obvious transition. So when we move from one genre to another, we feel that we are moving from one world to another. So again, we can see this emphasis on the boundaries between worlds, this emphasis on ontological issues. Intertextuality also foregrounds ontological preoccupations. When there is an emphasis on the intertextual nature of a work, the writer prompts us to ask the question, what do we mean when we say that a literary work exists? When this literary work builds upon its predecessors and borrows from its predecessors, what do we really mean when we say that this text exists? All of these are ontological preoccupations. I also intended to talk about If on a Winter's Night a Traveller as an excellent example of postmodernist fiction, but unfortunately my camera is running out of charge and I have to call it a day and finish the video right now. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to your comments and your suggestions or objections or criticisms in the chat box below.